Hello, my name's Jocelyn Pawley, and I'm a partner in the Commercial IT and Outsourcing team at Gowling WLG. In today's webinar, we are looking at disruption in IT contracts. That involves briefly understanding what makes up an IT supply contract or an IT stack, looking at what types of disruption might hit that and the effect that it might have, and then looking at the mitigations and protections that you can include in contracts or encourage your business to think about to protect against those risks. The one thing we won't cover today is cyber breaches. We've covered the effect of cyber breaches on an IT supply chain in other webinars. So for IT, we tend not to talk about a supply chain, but a stack, representing the idea you have a number of services that effectively sit on top of each other to provide an end user with the functionality that they access through a piece of software. So you have the SaaS layer, which is an application running on top of one or more platforms, which could be things like a Facebook or an SAP, or at a lower level, an operating system on a server. You then have the infrastructure, which is the servers and the hardware, also often provided as a service. And then at the bottom of the stack, you have the data centers and the power, so the physical locations from which these environments are run. The key difference here with a physical product supply chain is that all of these have to be operating all time, in real time, at the point at which the user wishes to engage with an IT solution, unlike a product supply chain, where a product is passed along over a period of time before it gets to the end user. So in order to assess the risks of that stack, you need to know factually who is part of it. So doing due diligence on a stack to establish the nature and the names of the companies that are part of that stack, to understand what part of the services each of them provides, because that might be significant for things like security considerations, and where in the world they are providing it from, because it might be a simple buying decision that you do not buy services from a particular territory, maybe because of sector rules, or because you're concerned about unrest in that country, or because you're concerned about other regulatory impacts, or even issues like enforcement. And clearly the level of diligence that you carry out will depend on whether you are buying a pre-existing IT stack, which comes to you as it is, and you take it or leave it if you don't like the risks, or whether you are building a bespoke product and you can be more selective about the players in that stack. So what types of disruption could affect an IT supply chain? Obviously, someone becoming insolvent, where the effects on the service might either be that you simply can't access the service you've procured, or that you can access it, but the data that should be sat within it isn't there because it is being held by someone hosting the data lower in the stack, and maybe they are the one who's become insolvent. Issues we see there are where liquidators trying to extract value for a business hold customers to ransom in order to access their software and their systems. Or we see parties terminating contracts with suppliers, although ultimately that probably doesn't mitigate against the effect of the insolvency. Force majeure is something we've talked about a lot more over the last couple of years than we ever thought we would. Arguably has less immediate impact on IT supply chains, given that this is automated software that can run without human intervention. But there are, of course, issues around support and development of environments where you do need that human input. So after time, there will certainly be some impact. Contractually, there's obviously relief for the party affected by the force majeure event, and losses lie where they fall. So it doesn't actually help parties mitigate if they're affected by force majeure. License infringements are bespoke and unique to IT environments. The effects will vary depending on the nature of the infringement and the nature of the software that it affects. Contractually, these scenarios are well dealt with and in some level of detail, where there will be obligations on suppliers to try to find workarounds to mitigate the effect of the infringement. If that can't be done, customer may have a termination right, and there is usually financial protection for a customer through an indemnity, certainly against the third-party infringement claim, and potentially also the wider damage to their business. And finally, poor service performance, a sort of more normal disruption, catered for in a contract through service levels, with credits payable if there is a breach, and often a termination right from material service level failure. So once you've done your due diligence to assess the nature of the stack that you're buying, the players in that stack, and what the particular risks are in your scenario, you can then think about a range of mitigations and protections to try to handle those risks. Not all of these will be relevant in all scenarios and not all will be suited to all risks, but it's a good idea to have an overview and to think of all the questions you might need to raise with suppliers early on in a procurement so you can work out which of these are appropriate contractual protections you want to include in terms and which are things that the business need to be aware of and to build into their operations going forwards. So firstly, escrow. This is where you have a specialist escrow provider and a tripartite agreement between them, the licensee and the licensor, where the source code to the software is held by the escrow provider and released on certain trigger events. The risk with escrow is always that the source code which is held in escrow is either not up to date or is deficient in some way and doesn't actually enable you to stand up the environment again and to run and operate the software, or that the documentation isn't sufficiently detailed to understand someone coming to the software cold to tell them how to operate it. In a SaaS environment, the additional consideration is the data that's held within that environment. A traditional source code SaaS agreement will not also pick up the data that's being handled by the system. Escrow providers are aware of this and have amended terms and come up with new agreements where they will take cuts of the data from within an environment and keep those in escrow in the same way as they would the source code. But you obviously need to have entered into the right terms with escrow providers for that to happen. Escrow is a very useful interim solution, but it is interim. It's designed to ensure that at the point at which a supplier fails, customer can continue to use the software, but ultimately the intention would be for a customer to re-procure and buy a solution from a supplier that's still existing in the market. You could look to more operational types of resilience, so understanding from the supplier how their system is specified and how it's been built, because sometimes you find there is resilience inherently within the way it's built. That looks different at different levels of the stack, and commercially there might be an impact as well. If it's built into a service, it might be more expensive service, or there may be cheaper services where there's an optional extra to have that level of resilience there in the background. There's clearly a crossover there with disaster recovery and business continuity plans, where you do see in larger contracts requirements on suppliers to have those plans, so it is effectively built into and part of the service that the customer is paying for. Contracts will often give some clarity on those plans being created and signed off by customers and tested with some frequency, so everyone has confidence in how they will apply. And sometimes the contract also speaks to the customer's own BCP and DR plans to require the supplier to engage in those exercises so the customer can see from a holistic point of view across its IT estate how those disasters might affect and how the exercises might run. Also important in this context are backups of data. Something that's often not well documented in contracts and maybe something that supplier does do, again, as part of their resilience and the nature of their service. But it's advisable to have the conversation so you have certainty whether it is something that supplier has built into their service or whether that's something that the customer ought to be doing manually through the supply system or something that can be added on and bought in addition, and then obviously contractualized so you know at what points data will be backed up and how long those backups will be kept. Step-in is a measure you will often see in larger outsourcing contracts, a useful looking protection for a customer to have comfort it could actually take over a service for an interim time if a supplier appears to be unable to deal with a particular issue. Not such a useful remedy and difficult in a cloud environment where there is a shared infrastructure and you're not the only customer using that service, as most customers will not suddenly want to find they're responsible for providing that cloud service to other customers in equivalence of their positions. And also because the best you can normally hope for is to achieve a step in at a management level. So still using a supplier's employees at a lower level and their resources, their systems, because it wouldn't be possible for a customer to suddenly spring all of that up and operate it itself. I think exit provisions are a really important mitigation to help facilitate a smooth transfer from an outgoing to an incoming supplier, because if you have those obligations in the contract, there's a clear path as to what both parties are expected to do and need to contribute, and even more useful if the clause has set some principles around pricing, so that at this point where the customer has little commercial leverage over its outgoing supplier, there isn't a difficult conversation about fees for exit. Also because the customer really does need their outgoing supplier to engage at this point to help make that exit as smooth as it can be. So important to have clauses that set out the key activities that each party will need to undertake, and possibly even more importantly, the documentation that the supplier will provide to the customer. So documentation being descriptions of services, operational manuals, user guides, so the customer has a good degree of detail about what has been provided previously or important touch points with the customer that they can pass over to an incoming supplier. Talking about data again, provisions setting out return of data are key, so it is clear how the customer gets its data back within its possession and in what format it is in. So it's something the customer can easily reuse and reintegrate, and the timing of when that would happen. And this is one to watch for in supplier standard terms, where the usual provision is you will see a supplier having a right to delete customer data within a period following termination, which if you read between the lines means that the customer actually needs to go in and itself take a copy of its data before that deletion happens. Often in a supply chain, a customer will try to protect itself by flowing down provisions, particularly policies around things like security or sustainability or anti-bribery. But if you are buying into an existing SaaS, then all those things will already have been set and built by the SaaS provider, and the customer must instead ask for how those things are dealt with in that supply chain and review those policies, and then decide whether or not it wishes to buy the SaaS as a whole. Also, though, important to be alive to the fact that terms might be flowed up through a chain, particularly in a situation where a customer is creating a bespoke environment. Suppliers at the top end of that chain will have relationships with others lower down the chain. And if this is not something holistic that's being packaged up and put out to the market, then it's quite common for those top end level suppliers to flow up terms from their lower level suppliers. And this can often happen quite late in the negotiation, and those terms tend to contain different warranties and exclusions and liabilities which cut across the terms you've been negotiating to date and upset the flow of the negotiation. Flowdowns are also important operationally, not just legally, particularly in areas like service levels for support. A customer will want comfort that if there is a priority one event that needs dealing with in a very short period of time, that they can see how that obligation flows down a supply chain, so each supplier is bound to come back within a timescale that rolls up altogether to still being a short remedy period for the customer. And finally, there are self-help provisions that customers can undertake outside of the contract, and I've mentioned a few already, such as proactively accessing data held by a supplier and taking their own copies. If systems are particularly significant, it could still be commercially worthwhile for a customer to have an alternative supplier contracted with some kind of standby system, or taking copies of systems at intervals such that it could be stood up if required. And again, the documentation. We often put clauses in contracts requiring suppliers to provide a customer operations manual or specifications of their systems, so customers have some detail on how those things operate if that supplier were to fail. So the takeaways from the sessions are to do your due diligence on your IT stack, so you understand who is involved and where in the world they are and what they are providing, so you can work out what the risks might be in your particular context, and then think about what the appropriate mitigations are and include the right terms in your contracts. That's all very well for new procurements, but for all of your existing estate, my advice would be to do due diligence now, so you have a good register and oversight of what suppliers you're using and where in the world they are, so that when these unexpected events happen and the business come needing to know how well does this affect us before how it affects us, you have a clear point of reference that you can go to that saves all those initial questions being asked under a lot of time pressure and make a smoother way to providing some certainty for the business. Thank you.